Hi everybody, this is part 2 of the Render Layers tutorial. If you haven't completed part 1 yet, check out the video description and go back to part 1 to render out the render layers from Maya, which you will see in the folder here. I'm going to go ahead and open up After Effects now because we're going to move on to the second step of compositing. Once After Effects is open, I want to create a new project. And before opening anything up, I will go into File, Project Settings, and I want to first change the time display style. And here it says the default base frame rate is 30 frames per second. I want this to match whatever I had in Maya for the animation. So if I were to look back at my Maya file, I would see that it was set to 24 frames per second. So I want to make sure that matches here. And I'm going to go back to the project settings and don't hit enter because that'll close that window. I want to also set the time display style to frames. I'll go into the color settings tab and change the depth to 32 bits per channel. And finally, I want to set the working space to linearize working space and hit OK. You can see at the bottom here it says 32 BPC, and that's what I want for this. Now I'm moving my After Effects window over so I can also see the images folder right next to it, and I'll minimize that. Once I have the After Effects and the folder next to each other so I can see both, I want to start bringing the images over here into the Project tab. And I see there are 2 layers here that have static at the end, and what that means is that I only rendered out 1 frame of each of these from Maya. So I'll start with both of those. I'll go into the RGB matte static, and in here I'll find a list of all the AOVs that I rendered out. I don't need all of these at the moment, I just want the beauty. So I'll go in that folder, select the image, drag and drop it over. I'm going to go back to the images folder and go into env all static. And for this, I also just want the beauty path. And I'll take that single image and drag it over here. And going back to the images folder, for the next 2 render layers, I want to import these as image sequences because if I go into the Car Grandma layer, you can see I have the AOVs. And if I go in the beauty folder, there's a whole list of images with the frame numbers. So I'll go back to the Car Grandma folder and drag the entire beauty folder over. And if I double click on that to display it, I can scrub in this timeline here and you can see it's kind of small, but there's an animation in there. I want to do the same thing for the cast shad layer. I'm selecting the beauty folder and dragging that over. Now this one looks like it's completely black, but it's actually not because there is some data inside the alpha channel. So if I go down inside the timeline and there's show channel and color management settings, if I scroll down to alpha, you can see there's a shadow that's in white there. And I'll switch this back to RGB. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and maximize the After Effects window. And if I expand the Project tab, I can see a little bit more information about my images. It says the frame rate that it was imported at, plus the full path to the images in case I ever need to look for them again. If you want to see more information here, you can right-click and select some different columns. Usually we don't need all of these, but this is good for troubleshooting purposes. I'm going to close that back up. First of all, I want to create a composite of the character over the background. So I'm going to select the Car Grandma Beauty and env all static and do new comp from selection. And I want to make sure it's selecting the dimensions from Car Grandma Beauty. you can see that it's created a composite of the character over the background. And if I go ahead and hit spacebar, that'll play it back. And you see that the environment is only on the first frame, so I need to expand that lower layer. I'm going to select ENVL static down here and click on the edge of the purple bar and expand it. And hit the spacebar to play. And now it's going for the whole frame range. One thing I want to do now is put a sky in the background because right now it's just a transparent black. So if I restore my After Effects window, go back to my images folder, inside the textures folder, I have a sky that I downloaded, and I'm going to drag that over here. And I can click on that image and drag it under the ENVL layer inside my composite. And then with it selected, I can move it around, open this up. I can also scale it down. And let me maximize this again. Once I have the sky in there, I'll hit spacebar in my timeline to play it back. And you might notice something wrong with this picture. The character is over the background, but she kind of looks like she's floating because there's no shadow connecting her to the ground. And that's actually why we rendered this cast shadow layer. So I'm going to hit spacebar again to stop this. And what I'm going to do is drag the cast shad layer in between Car Grandma and the ENV all layer. So you can see it in between. And if I scroll with my middle mouse, I can zoom in, and if I middle mouse drag, I can bring this up a bit so I can see a little bit better what that's doing. And I can turn on and off the visibility of this cast shadow layer. So now when I play it back, she does look grounded, but looking at this shadow, it's a different color from the other shadows in the scene. All of the other shadows look like they're dark green because they're picking up the color from the ground and a little bit of color from the sky. So I want to use this cast shadow a little bit differently. In my composition, I'm going to select the ENV all static and then go into Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. I want to make sure that I'm using the cast shadow layer as a mask for it, or in After Effects terms, it would be the track matte. And in case you don't see this column over here, you might see After Effects looking like this. And if that's the case, then you want to right-click on the top level bar, go to Columns, and make sure Modes is turned on. And then I see the Mode column as well as the track matte. I'm going to select the adjustment layer I just created, and under the track matte, I want to change this to Alpha Matte Cast Shad Beauty. And you can see that that made the cast shadow invisible, but it is working internally right now. And if I go into the effect controls right now, I can right-click and add a color correction. And I'm going to put in a hue saturation effect. And in here, I want to bring the lightness down. And notice what's happening in the viewer right now. It is making the shadow area darker. And if I put it all the way to -100, it's black. And then it can be lighter or darker. So I'm eyeballing the other shadows in the background and trying to make it match. So putting it at -80 gets it right about there. And I could also change the color of the shadow by changing the hue. So I'm going to tweak it just a little bit to make it more bluish. But I don't want to go overboard on this. And now when I play it back, it does look like it was all rendered together. Now that that's done, I'm going to give this adjustment layer a descriptive name. So I'll right-click, rename, and I'll name this CC_cast shad. And you might be wondering why we decided to split it up like this. And one of the advantages of this is if, say, you were to go back to Maya and make a change to your character animation, you might think that you have to render everything all over again. But because you have the shadow and the character separate from the background, you actually wouldn't have to render the background again. You could just render the character layer and the cast shadow layer and then re-import that footage, and then you wouldn't have to change anything else. It'll help you manage your time well because you won't have to constantly be re-rendering every single layer. So suppose I were to render this out and then I showed it to my professor or a director, and they looked at this and they said, I want the sunlight to be a bit brighter and I want you to make the shadows just a little bit darker. One way you could address that note is by going back to Maya and re-rendering, but there's a lot faster way you can do this in After Effects. That will show you why we rendered out the light AOVs. I'm going to select the ENV all static and go to replace with pre-comp. So it'll replace every instance of the ENV all render with this pre-comp where we can do some other things with this environment render. I'm going to rename this to pre-comp ENV all. And if I double click on that, I can see it just has the environment render in there. And I'm going to restore After Effects again so I can see my images folder. And I'll go back into the ENV all static folder. And now I can use some of these other AOVs. And when we were in Maya, we rendered out RGB light AOVs for the sun and the sky. So I'm going to select the sun first. And then go back and bring in the RGBA sky. I want to select both of these layers and then drag them into the composition under ENV all static and maximize this again. And I want to reorder them so that the sun is above the sky but still under the beauty. If I make the ENV all static invisible, I can see this is what the sun AOV looks like. That's just the contribution of the sunlight. And then if I make that invisible, I see just the contribution of the sky dome. Now I want to make the sun AOV visible again. And then under the mode, these are the blending modes for the layers. I want to add these two together because adding them together should give me what I had for the beauty pass. So I'll change the blend mode to add. And now if I make the beauty visible and invisible, you can see that it's almost the same. The only difference is that the glass is getting brighter, and that's only because it's doubling up. But you can see that adding these two light contributions adds back up to what I had for the beauty pass. So I actually no longer need this, so I can select the beauty and delete it. And then when I go back and look at Car Grandma Beauty, nothing has changed. This is exactly what I had before. I'm going to rename this to Comp Final because that's the final composite with everything in it. I want to go back and address the note about making the sun brighter. So if I select this sun layer in here, I can go into Effect Controls and add a color correction, exposure. And if I scroll on the exposure field, you can see that I can make the sun much brighter without changing the color of the shadows. So if I wanted to make the sun a tiny bit brighter, I could leave that at 1. And you can turn the effect on and off to see what that looks like. And if I do the same thing to the sky, this time I'm going to add a different color correction because say they told me that they wanted the shadows to be a bit more blue. So if I go into color correction and add a hue saturation, then you can see as I rotate that, the color slightly changes. In practice, you don't want to go too overboard in comp. If you had to make any more drastic changes in the lighting, that should be done in Maya, but for small tweaks, this can be a lot faster and a lot easier to see the changes right away. Now, if I made any comp changes to the lighting of the environment, I'll have to apply those same changes to the character in order to keep them consistent with each other. So I'll just repeat everything I did, but this time with the characters. So going back to my project tab, I want to select the Car Grandma Beauty and replace with pre-comp. Rename that to pre-comp Car Grandma. And in my images folder, I'm going to select the RGBA Sky and RGBA Sun folders. And remember, we're selecting folders this time because we want these to be imported as footage. And go into the Car Grandma layer and select the two AOVs. Drag them into the composition. And I'll make the beauty layer invisible, change the mode to add, and double check to make sure they're lining up. Now I can delete the beauty. I want to copy all of the color corrections I did in the ENV pre-comp over to the Grandma pre-comp. So I'll go into pre-comp ENV all and select the sun layer, go to effect controls and select this exposure. Hit Control C to copy it. Move over to the character pre-comp, select the sun AOV, and hit Control V to paste it. I want to go back to the ENV pre-comp, select the sky layer, select the hue saturation effect and hit Control C, and go into the pre-comp Grandma, select the sky layer in there, and hit Control V. So now it'll look like they're all getting hit by the same light if I go back to my project and look at the comp final. So now I have my render with a brighter sun and slightly bluer shadows. And suppose I showed this and I got a note back saying that the lighthouse should be a little bit darker because we don't want the house and the lighthouse to be the same color. Again, if I went back to Maya and changed the textures and rendered out, that could take a long time, but we have a way of changing the color of just the lighthouse in here as well, and that's because we rendered out an RGB matte. And this matte is a way of isolating different parts of the environment, so I have the lighthouse in red, and I can use that as a mask for color correction. So I'm going to go into my environment pre-comp and select the RGB matte and drag that in. And I want to put it at the very top of the stack. And you can see that you can see the fences through it, and that's because the fences were punched out of the RGB matte layer. I'm going to select the sun layer in here and then go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Let's select the RGB matte static and go into effect controls because right now I only want the red part of this. So I'll go into Effect, Channel, Set Matte, expand this a bit. In here there's a Take Matte from Layer property and Use for Matte. The Use for Matte is set to alpha currently and that's the default. But I want to go in and set this to red because that's the lighthouse. So now I have just the lighthouse. Going back to this adjustment layer, I want to set this as a track matte. So if I go into the track matte column, I want to change this to alpha matte RGB matte. And that'll make the RGB matte invisible. Let's rename this to CC_lighthouse. And in here, I'm going to put in a color correction effect, hue saturation. And if I play with the lightness, I can make the lighthouse darker as I need to. And if I change the hue, I could change the color of it. But for now, I just want to make it darker. And maybe add a little bit of saturation to bring out the red. Within this adjustment layer, I can add any number of effects that I want, anything that I want to only affect the lighthouse and nothing else. Before I move on, I'm going to save this file. So go to File, Save As. I want to go to my desktop and save it in the same folder where I have all my other work, which is the Render Layers Demo folder. And I will name this Comp Lighthouse and save. And then I want to also do a file increment and save, and that'll attach a number to the end of the file name. I can keep doing that while I'm working to save more versions. Now I'm going to go back to the project tab and look at my comp final to see how everything is looking together. And what I'd like to do next is add a little bit of depth of field to blur out the background of this cliff. That'll be something else that's done in the environment all pre-comp, because I want the character to stay sharp, so having this separate allows greater control over that. And I'm going to select the RGB matte at the top of the comp and add a new adjustment layer. And this time I want to bring in the Z AOV for my environment. So I'll go back to Images, ENV All Static. And the one I want this time is Z. And I'm going to drag that into the Project tab. And maximize AfterEffects. So you'll see that this looks like it's solid white, but it's actually not. So if you drag your mouse over this, you can see in the info on the upper right, there are some very large values in there. So I'm going to drag this into the top level of my composition. And this adjustment layer I'm going to name to DOF. Once I have my adjustment layer in there, I'm going to go back and select the Z AOV and go into the effect controls. And I want to actually start to visualize the values that are in here. And I can't because they're so high. So I'll go into Effect, Color Correction, Exposure. And I want to bring this exposure way down so that I can start to see the really high values. So I'm just scrolling over it with my right mouse button. And I'm looking in the viewer to see if anything's changing. And I see around 12, there is something changing. So now it's kind of looking like a background fog layer around 14 or 15. And I can also tweak the offset in here, and that increases the contrast in some ways. So playing with these two values, I want to get it so that the foreground is mostly black and that the background is as close to solid white as possible. And I can mouse over this to see what the values are like. So looking at the upper right info, I can see the background is about at 0.5, so I'll want to increase the exposure. And that's around 0.7. And now it's at about 0.86, so that's pretty good. And then if I tweak the offset, I don't want it to be completely black, but I want some darker values in there. So at about negative 0.28 and negative 13.72, I get a pretty good range of values that I can work with. Now I'm going to go back and select the DOF adjustment layer that I created and create Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Camera Lens Blur. And to see what's happening, I'm actually going to make the Z layer invisible. And now I can see there's an overall blur being applied to the image. So first of all, look at what's happening at the edge of this image. It is getting a little darker and I don't want that. So I'll turn on repeat edge pixels, and if I turn that on and off, you can see what's happening to the edge there. And now I want to use the Z pass as the blur map. So under blur map, I'll go to layer and say env all static Z. And that doesn't really change anything because it's ignoring the effect that I added to the Z depth. So in order to get it properly, I'll go to source, effects and masks, and that'll take into account the exposure that I applied. So now this is getting me in the direction that I want to go. I can see that there's some blur in the background, but the foreground is pretty sharp. And now I can start adjusting different attributes here. So if I change the blur radius, that'll change the overall blur. And that's way too much, but that helps me see exactly what's happening. And if I change the blur focal distance, that'll tell me at what point things are still sharp. I want to get it so that the sign is somewhat sharp because I know the character is close to it. So around 0.13, it's about where I want the focus distance to be, and then I can go back and take the blur radius way down because I just want a little bit of blur in the background. So this is a pretty good way to fake depth of field in the composite because I didn't actually render this with depth of field from Maya, which is something I could have done. And while it's a good approximation, if I'm being a perfectionist, there are some issues here. There's a little bit of blur around the edge of the sign back here and on the edge of the roof, which doesn't make much sense because the rest of the house is in fact sharp. And same thing with the lighthouse. And if you look closely, there's a bit of a sharp edge on the back of the cliff as well. So if I want to make this a little bit better, what I can do is select the Z depth AOV inside the composite and go to pre-compose and move all attributes into the new composition. And I'll rename this to pre-comp Z. Inside the pre-comp Z that I've created, I have just the env static Z. And what I want to do for this is expand the edges out just a little bit so that they can account for all the edges that need to be blurred. And to do that, the first thing I need to do is assign a mask for this whole thing. One thing to know about the ZAOV is that it doesn't come in with a usable alpha channel, so that means we have to grab the alpha from something else. And I can get it from the beauty path, so I'll grab the env beauty, put it on top. And in the track mat column, I want to change this to alpha envl static beauty and make sure this is invisible. And now if I look back, I can see that the alpha is the same as what was there for the beauty pass. So now I'm going to make a copy of this Z layer. So I'll do a Control C, Control V. And then on the lower one, I want to expand the edges because I don't want to change anything for the image itself, but just add a little bit to the edges. So I'm going to add an effect called Minimax, which is under Channel. Minimax. And you can see that automatically adds a white background to everything. And what it's doing is expanding the edge pixels. So I'm going to turn off the top Z layer so it can just work with this one. And select the one underneath. And if I change the radius of the Minimax, you can see kind of what it's doing. A higher value is shrinking the edges, but I want to change the operation to minimum, and that'll actually expand. So I can scroll and show that what that's doing. So I want to set this to something relatively low, 5, and make sure don't shrink edges is on. And if I go back and turn on the other layer, I can see that now the edge is expanded, but there's also this kind of pixelated black edge that I don't want. To fix that black edge, I want to add a minimax to the beauty layer as well. So I'll go to Effect, Minimax, and for this one, I want to affect not the color channel, but the alpha and color. And if I change the radius, you can see if it's set to maximum, that's actually making the issue worse. So I want to change this to minimum, and that gives a smoother transition between the two. So I'll set this to the lowest I possibly can. At 1 pixel, that looks fine. And this may look a little strange here, but if I go back to the project and back to my final comp, you can see that the edges of the house and the lighthouse don't look as halo-y as they did before, because it's not getting confused about which depth value to use. One final thing I can do on this is I can see that the background of the cliff is blurry, but the sky is not, and the sky should be blurry because it's further back than the cliff. So I'll select the sky layer and add a camera lens blur, and just keep that at the default because that'll be about the same as the background of the cliff. So there's a lot more I could do with this, and I hope this was helpful in showing how AOVs can save you render time. If there's any small changes I want to make after running a long render, I can create a custom render layer for any part of the scene. Say I wanted to change the color of the rooftop, I could go back and render out an RGB matte just for that part. If I wanted to change any of the lighting, I could increase the exposure on the light AOVs. And if I have any new animation, I can just go back and render the character and the shadow without rendering the environment. So this concludes this portion of the tutorial. I could go render this whole thing out as a movie or an image sequence and then use it in the edit. Thank you for watching.